In the tranquil town of Snowbell, winter did not simply arrive. It took up residence as if intending a permanent stay. Snow fell not in cheerful flurries, but in a silent drift, blanketing rooftops and muting the world's sounds. The trees stood stoic and heavy beneath a layer of ice, and the roads wound softly around frozen fields, now deserted of play. At the very end of Willowbend Lane, inside a yellow house with flaking shutters and a motionless porch swing, Nova Elkins sat enveloped in a red coat 2 sizes too large. She kept it on even within the house, regardless of the fire blazing in the hearth. Laughter had become foreign to her, ever since her world had fundamentally shifted. At 7 years of age, Nova possessed eyes that seemed far older, gray and perpetually watchful, forever scanning the outlines of silence. Her father, Daniel Elkins, had been a firefighter, the type of man who charged into blazing structures as others fled. He did not return from his final emergency call. A wildfire, the town was told. A collapsed beam, a community in mourning. A young girl retreated deep within herself. Her mother, Elise, who had once been a school art teacher, now occupied a hospital bed, her breathing faint and fragile following a car crash that generated more questions than it answered. And within the house, Mark Doyle, the man Nova was instructed to call Dad, moved from room to room with heavy footfalls and somber eyes. He wasn't overtly cruel, at least not initially. He was merely detached, methodical, and as frigid as a January window pane. The warmth Nova once knew had disappeared. All that was left was the oppressive weight of snow and the sound of emptiness. 3 days prior to the storm's most severe impact, a knock sounded at the door. Nova heard it from the hallway. It was a sequence of 2 quick raps followed by a single, longer one, a knock that didn't demand entry, but rather patiently awaited a response. Mark remained in his chair, his gaze locked on the television screen. Consequently, Nova opened the door herself. A man was standing there, bundled in a well-worn parka and a thick scarf. His beard was flecked with gray, and he had a slight lean to the left, as if the cold had warped something within his bones. His eyes, however, radiated warmth. "Hello, Nova," he said softly. "Do you remember me?" She blinked, not quite recalling him, yet a stir in her chest suggested a flicker of memory, not of his face, but of the tales her father used to share. This was Mateo Ruiz, her father's old friend, a park ranger who had gone camping with Daniel in the mountains and had made a promise years ago that he now held in his hands. He offered her a box, enclosed in brown paper and secured with twine, with small holes perforated in its sides. The air around it pulsed gently, carrying a warm and subtly sweet scent. Nova took a hesitant step closer. As her fingers grazed the lid, Mateo whispered, "Your father extracted a promise from me that if he were ever gone, I would find you the most brilliant and courageous puppy I could." Within the box, swaddled in an old fleece blanket, lay a German shepherd puppy, no more than 8 weeks old. His fur was a mix of gentle earth tones and the hue of early morning light. He blinked at her slowly, let out a sound that was part yawn and part whimper, and nudged his wet nose against her palm. Nova's breath caught. The ache that had settled in her chest began to ease. "I'm going to name him Sonny," she uttered, the words spoken so softly she feared they might shatter. "Because he feels warm." Mark materialized in the doorway behind them, his arms folded across his chest, his expression unchanging. "A dog," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. Nova did not reply, too engrossed in cradling Sonny to her chest, already fearful of letting him go. The days following Sonny's arrival were altered. They were not louder or brighter, but somehow possessed a softer quality. The house continued to creak under the strain of the cold, and the radiator hissed like a weary exhalation. But new sounds emerged, the tap of paws on the floorboards, the soft snuffling as Sonny investigated every room with cautious curiosity. He became Nova's constant shadow. When she sat reading by the front window, Sonny would curl up at her feet, his nose nestled against her socks. As she moved quietly through the kitchen, her toes tracing the patterns on the tiles, he would trail just behind her, always close. At night, with Mark asleep in his chair and the news still murmuring from the television, Nova would quietly carry Sonny upstairs to sleep at the foot of her bed. Sonny was not a barker. He had no need to be. His mere presence was a comfort, a quiet protector, a patient confidant. and a purpose for waking each morning. Nova started speaking again, though her words were reserved for him alone. She confided her fears into his attentive ears, recounting stories of her father and the dreams she once had of her mother returning with a balloon, saying, "Let's go find somewhere warm." She described the pine tree in their backyard where her father would hang small paper stars on its branches whenever life felt too burdensome. Sonny listened with an attentiveness no one else had ever shown. His ears would perk, his gaze would follow her, and his head would tilt as if the weight of her confessions truly mattered. Mark perceived the shift in her, and it displeased him. During dinner, he would observe Nova with a clenched jaw, the scrape of his fork on the plate serving as a stark warning. "You are becoming overly attached," he grumbled one evening. "He's only a dog." Nova offered no response, instead reaching beneath the table to stroke Sonny's fur, a warm, reassuring presence. When the blizzard descended and the lights began to flicker, Sonny remained unshaken. He positioned himself between Nova and the window, as if daring the wind itself to challenge him. And for the first time in many weeks, Nova smiled in her sleep, not because the hurt had vanished, but because she now had someone, who would stay. It occurred on a Tuesday. Overnight, the snow had deepened, blanketing the world in a muffled white. The wind wailed through the eaves with a mournful sound. Inside, Nova was seated cross-legged on the rug by the fireplace, constructing towers from old wooden blocks. Sonny was lying next to her, his chin on his paws, his ears twitching with every creak of the house. Mark returned home early that day, his boots caked with snow and his breath sharp in the cold air. He shrugged off his coat in the entryway, and his eyes instantly narrowed upon seeing Sonny in the house. "I've told you," he said, his voice level and cold. "No dogs are allowed in this house." Nova went still, her hands poised over a block. Sonny remained motionless, simply gazing up at Mark with his tail still and his eyes calm. "He isn't bothering anything," Nova said softly. "It is so cold outside. He was shivering last night." Mark advanced a step. "It is a dog, Nova, not a person. It has no place in the living room, the kitchen, or anywhere near the sofa." Before Nova could form a reply, he snapped his fingers, gesturing sharply toward the back door. "Outside. Now." Sonny did not budge until Nova rose to her feet. She offered no argument, walking to the door with her head bowed. She opened it and watched as her only friend stepped out into the frigid air. Mark threw a thin blanket onto the back porch. "That should be sufficient," he muttered. Later that night, when the house fell silent, Nova slipped outside. She wrapped Sonny in her old baby quilt and sat with him in the shed. There was no flashlight, no exchange of words, just two small beings sharing quiet breaths in the darkness. And despite her cheeks stinging from the cold, she whispered, "I will stay with you for as long as it takes." The wind howled with the intensity of a warning. It was a cold that didn't just bite. It seeped into the walls, the windows, and the bones. The electricity had flickered twice that morning, and the sky was a cruel, colorless pale. Nova stood over the sink, rinsing the same cup for the third time, while Sonny lay behind her near the heating vent, soaking up the last vestiges of warm air. Mark entered the kitchen, his gaze sweeping the floor before it came to a halt. There, subtle yet discernible, were paw prints on the rug. Sonny's, from the last time Nova had let him inside. She hadn't managed to clean them up completely. Her grip on the cup grew tighter. "I told you," Mark stated, his voice low and sharp, like the edge of a knife. His lack of shouting was more menacing. He seized Sonny by the scruff of his neck, not with enough force to cause injury, but with a hardness that was meant to instill fear, and dragged him toward the back door. Nova dropped the cup. "Stop," she cried out, running after them. "Please." He didn't mean to, he was cold. "I didn't," but Mark paid her no mind. He moved with a grim determination, his boots crunching in the snow, his breath pluming like smoke. Nova pursued him out into the biting wind, her coat unfastened, her gloves forgotten, her feet scrambling for purchase as she ran. They traversed the backyard, passed through the open gate, and entered the park where the large, old maple tree stood, its trunk wide and its bark fissured with age. Mark produced a worn rope from his pocket. Wordlessly, he looped it around Sonny's neck and secured the other end to the ancient tree. The dog offered no resistance, merely looking back at Nova with a confused but calm, trusting expression. There, Mark muttered. Let him freeze along with your excuses. A small, sharp, broken sound escaped Nova, almost a scream. Mark wheeled around to face her, his eyes like stone. If you mention this to anyone, I will take him to the pound. We'll see how long he survives there. Then he turned and walked away, vanishing into the swirling white. Nova waited just until he was out of view. Then she ran, her knees plunging into the deep snow, her hands shaking as she struggled with the knot. It refused to yield. Her fingers were too numb, too small. She did the only thing she could think of. She sank to the ground, wrapped her arms around Sonny, and she curled herself around his trembling frame. The snow fell with increasing intensity. Her breaths became shallow. And there, beneath the old maple, a little girl offered up all the warmth she had left. From the window of her small blue house across the street, Riley Bloom was washing dishes when she noticed something amiss. Initially, she mistook it for a mound of snow beneath the maple tree. But then the wind shifted, and she caught a slight movement, a small shape, a glint of golden fur, and a sliver of red fabric too thin for such extreme cold. Her heart lurched. Without pausing for a coat or shoes, Riley dashed from her kitchen, managing to grab only a scarf and her half-laced boots. She stumbled on the front steps, righted herself, and then sprinted across the icy road, the driven snow stinging her cheeks. Upon reaching the tree, she fell to her knees. "Nova," she breathed. The small girl was unresponsive. She was tightly curled around the German shepherd, her face hidden in its fur, her arms rigid yet protective. The dog whimpered faintly, lifting its head just long enough to see Riley before it slumped down again. Riley moved with urgency. She unwound her scarf and bundled it around Nova, then lifted the child into her arms. Nova was alarmingly weightless. The chill had permeated her skin and settled deep in her bones. She had stopped shivering, which was the most dangerous sign. Riley tucked the puppy inside her coat, cradling them both as if they were fragile embers, and hurried back to her house. Inside, the warmth was a welcome shock. She placed Nova on the couch, enveloping her in multiple blankets, and set the dog, who was still nameless to her, in a towel-lined basket near the fire. His breathing was faint but regular. Riley phoned Mrs. Heller, a retired nurse living 2 doors away. The older woman arrived within minutes, her thick gray braid secured under a wool hat, her hands brimming with purpose. "She's suffering from hypothermia," Mrs. Heller stated, feeling for Nova's pulse. "But she will recover." Riley didn't respond. She was on her knees by the couch, her gaze fixed on Nova's small hands, which were still curled as if clinging to something that was no longer there. She did not weep. She simply remained. And for the first time in many days, Nova was warm. The snow had subsided, but the silence lingered. Nova had been with Riley for almost a week. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her voice, while still soft, had lost its tremble. Yet, a restless quality lingered in her gaze, a question she had not yet voiced. One afternoon, as Riley met with a woman from social services, Mrs. Heller kept Nova company. The retired nurse moved around Riley's kitchen with a familiarity born of years, warming soup and humming old hymns. It was then that Nova asked, "Could I go home for just a little while?" Mrs. Heller stopped, sensing more in the question's tone than its words. "Are you certain?" Nova nodded. "There is something I have to find." They crossed the road at a slow pace. The yellow house seemed smaller now, more subdued. Mark was no longer there. The locks had been replaced. The silence within felt as though the house itself was holding its breath. Nova ascended the stairs, her boots making soft thuds on the old wooden steps as she headed for the hallway closet. Above it was the attic hatch. She pulled a chair over and pushed the hatch open. The ladder groaned in protest, but she climbed it. The attic carried the scent of cedar and accumulated winter dust. She knew precisely what she was searching for. In a distant corner, under a moth-eaten quilt and a broken lamp, was a wooden box she recalled from when she was 4. Inside were old photographs, fire department patches, letters bound with green string, and a single envelope with her father's handwriting on it. "For Nova, when you're ready." She sat cross-legged on the floor and carefully opened it. "Sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I'm not there. But I need you to know I never left you. Not really. I'm with you in every brave thing you do. Some people will pretend to care just to control. Don't trust their voices. Trust your own. It's stronger than you think. Love always, Dad." Nova closed her eyes, clutching the letter to her chest. Then she got to her feet, climbed back down, and said to Mrs. Heller, "I am ready to leave now." The woman who came to Riley's door was dressed in a navy wool coat and held a leather folder. Her name was Karen Whitmore, a social worker from the county's child safety unit. She had a tranquil gaze, one that suggested she had witnessed much hardship but retained her capacity for kindness. Riley made her a cup of tea. Nova sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot cocoa. Sonny was at her feet, his head resting on her slippers. Karen smiled gently. "Nova, I am here to be of help, but only if you feel ready to talk." Nova glanced at Riley, who offered a subtle nod of encouragement. She looked down at Sonny, who gave no sign but remained perfectly still, as he always did when she needed strength. Then she reached into her coat pocket and laid the letter on the table. Karen unfolded it deliberately, her eyes following Daniel Elkins's script in silence. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but her focus remained on the page until she finished. "Did he hurt you?" Karen asked gently. Nova did not flinch. "Not with his hands," she replied. "But he stole things from me. My voice, my sense of safety, and Sonny." Her voice was steady. And now, Nova reached down, her fingers stroking the soft fur between Sonny's ears. "I have gotten them back." Karen exhaled through her nose, a quiet gesture of approval. "You were very brave to speak up, Nova." Nova shook her head. "I was brave enough to survive. Speaking up was just recalling that I had the power to do so." Nothing further needed to be said. Outside, the wind had finally softened. In Snowbell, spring did not burst forth suddenly. Its arrival was gradual, like a person learning to trust once more. The snow retreated in patches. The wind shed its harsh edge. Crocuses emerged from the thawing earth like small hands reaching for the light. And in the backyard of the yellow house at the end of Willowbend Lane, something new was beginning to flourish. Nova stood beneath the tall pine tree, the one her father had called the star tree. A few faded and delicate paper stars still clung to its branches, rustling in the breeze like memories that refused to fade. Beside her, Sonny sat alert and silent, his coat now thicker, more robust, a golden brown flecked with pine needles. He was no longer the frightened puppy from the box. He was an integral part of her world, her anchor, her shadow, her source of warmth. In Nova's gloved hands was a new star, fashioned from silver paper. Its edges were slightly imperfect, but it gleamed in the gentle morning sun. She tied it with a piece of twine and hung it on a low branch, where Sonny could see it. "This one is for you," she said softly. From the porch, Elise watched, wrapped in a knitted shawl. Her recovery was gradual but consistent. The doctors had termed it a miracle. She attributed it to her daughter's voice, which she felt had guided her back. That evening, Riley gave Nova a printed sheet of paper. It was the article she had written, titled, "When a Child Saves a Dog and the Dog Saves Her Right Back," which was set to be published in the local newspaper. The following day, Nova read it in silence, then folded it neatly and put it on the bookshelf next to her father's letter, now housed in a pine frame. That night, she and Sonny curled up together under a soft quilt. Her sleep was free of nightmares, filled only with quietude and steady breathing. And somewhere in the tree above, the stars seemed to sway gently, as if in silent approval.